Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Tonight's podcast brought to you by Audible.com, a leading provider of spoken audio information and entertainment. You can listen to audiobooks whenever and wherever you want. Our featured book tonight is actually by my special guest, Dr. Jerry Coyne, Why Evolution is True, which is available in audio form on Audible.com, read by the author. And it's a great book because it sort of weaves together all the latest work in genetics and paleontology, geology, molecular biology, anatomy, in sort of real-world civilian terms that you and I can understand, talking about the processes that Darwin proposed and why evolution is actually a scientific truth. It's a great way to sort of get past the misunderstandings about evolution and understand it as it really is from the perspective of a genuine biologist. Check out Why Evolution is True by Dr. Jerry Coyne. You can get your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at this link. Go to audibletrial.com/thethinkingatheist. I'm glad we're covering this topic tonight. I just finished listening again to the debate that Matt Dillahunty just had with Ray Comfort. He was on a Minnesota AM radio station. Ray Comfort essentially didn't debate. He just dodged and danced the whole time. Matt would make an assertion, make a comment, ask a question, and this Ray would just preach. And it wasn't even fresh stuff. It was the stuff we've been dealing with for years and years and years. The argument from design. Where do your morals come from? Absolute morality. The complexity of the human eye. He even trotted out the 747 argument. I mean, it was just embarrassing. But that ties into what we're talking about tonight, because much of it deals with evolution versus creationism. What's the science say? What do the facts say? Well, let's talk to a genuine expert. Dr. Jerry Coyne has a Ph.D. in evolutionary biology from Harvard. He serves as professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago. He's member of both the Committee on Genetics and the Committee of Evolutionary Biology, and he's author of several books, including Speciation and Why Evolution is True. Dr. Jerry Coyne, thank you so much for being on the show tonight.
My pleasure.
So you identify as, what, an atheist? I mean, you don't believe in any deity anywhere for any reason, right?
Correct, yeah. I mean, I'm the kind of atheist that just says there's no evidence of what I believe, as opposed to the kind of atheist who says, I know there is no God, which isn't really a scientifically tenable proposition.
So what, do you have like a religious background? Did you come out of religion or not?
Well, I was brought up as a Reformed Jew, which is about a hair's breadth from atheism. And I flunked out of Hebrew school, the only time I've ever failed academically in my life. I was never bar mitzvahed, and I would guess it was 69 or 67, the year the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album came out. I had an instantaneous conversion to atheism, which I remember well. I was sitting on the couch at my parents' house listening to the album. I don't remember the track. And all of a sudden it just struck me that everything I had been told about God up to that moment was wrong. There's no evidence for it. And I don't know why this happened. I really don't. But it was very strong and striking. And for about 5 minutes, I just was in bad shape. I started shaking and sweating and thinking, oh, my God, when I die, that's it. There's no heaven. And then I got over it. In about 20 minutes, I was fine, and I've been an atheist ever since.
We're always dealing with these sometimes frustrating questions. I mean, these tired accusations and questions and charges in the debate arena from creationists. The same stuff over and over. These arguments just aren't going away, are they?
Yeah, I mean, occasionally I'll come up with a new one, like the new fine-tuning argument, which we may get to about the physical parameters of the universe. But since it's all motivated by religion in the end, it's never going to go away. That's my theory. That's why, actually, another thing that led me to become a vociferous atheist rather than a quiet atheist was that my realization that all my teaching of evolution was falling on deaf ears, or a lot of it at least, because these religious earplugs that people have, their faith could not permit them to hear the truth. And that made me realize that if you want to teach evolution, you have to get rid of religion. And then I realized that the invidious effects of religion are far more widespread than just creationism and far more harmful than just creationism. So I have two hats now, as an evolutionary biologist and as a heathen, or as you call them.
Well, tonight's show is really kind of a classroom for all of us. We're going to address evolution, what it is, what it's not. So let's start with a common assertion by the creationist that evolution is just a theory.
That accusation is very common. I think it's probably the most profound misunderstanding, either willful or based on ignorance, a misunderstanding of evolution in the United States, to say something like it. Ronald Reagan said that in 1980, evolution is only a theory, and implying that it's a guess or a speculation. But in science, and this is my response to that criticism, a theory is an explanatory framework for observations and data that you have in nature that holds together. So, for example, we have the theory of gravity and the theory of atoms. We have the germ theory of disease, that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms. And those aren't guesses or speculations. Those are well-established frameworks of how things work in nature. And eventually, theories, which are these explanatory frameworks, graduate into facts as more and more evidence accumulates to buttress them. So, the theory of atoms is still called the theory of atoms, or the atomic theory, but we know that atoms are true. So to say that that's a speculation or guess is crazy. Same thing with the germ theory of disease. We know now that infectious diseases like AIDS or measles or mono are caused by infectious microorganisms. We still call it the germ theory of disease, but it's also fact that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms. And evolution is supported by just as much evidence as is the theory of atoms or the germ theory of disease. So all three of these theories are far more than hypotheses, wild guesses, or speculations, which is the sort of average American's conception of the term. They are well-established explanatory framework. So that's why I call my book Why Evolution is True. I could have said why the theory of evolution is true, which would have been equally accurate, but this misunderstanding of what a theory is on the part of the public led me to leave it out and just say evolution is true. So that's a misconception, which can be easily dispelled just by saying, well, we still call it the theory of gravity, but when you step outside of a window, you don't think you're going to go up. So
do you take some heat from people over your use of the word true? Why evolution is true? I mean, in the skeptical community, sometimes people get weird about the word true. Is that a problem?
Yeah, they do. And a lot of that is philosophers, not necessarily, because they understand how we scientists use the word. Religious people think of true as something that's unchangeably true, an absolute truth. If you're a deist, you will say, or a theist, you'll say there is a God, and there's nothing on earth that would ever change my mind about that. No evidence that you give me could unconvince me. But I use true, and I explain this in the book so that there will be no misunderstanding that. True in science means, I use Steve Gould's characterization of the word truth as evidence that is so strong and so convincing that you would have to be perverse to deny it. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be overturned, because things that are supported by what we think are good evidence can suddenly be overturned by a new paradigm, which is what happened with classical physics, which we now see as a subset of quantum physics. So truth, what I mean by true, and I explain this in the book, is provisionally true. It's something that's supported by so much evidence that at the moment that you perceive that evidence, you'd have to be perverse or blinkered or willfully ignorant to deny it. So I don't really get much pushback from creationists on this, even though their notion of truth is absolute truth, because they have other things to pick on, like the evidence itself.
Okay, well, let's role play for a little bit. I'm going to pitch to you some common arguments against evolution. And I'll let you address them because I'm sure you have many times. We'll start with this one. Evolution isn't observable today.
False. I mean, we have at least 300 or 400 observable examples of evolution, and by observable I mean over a human lifetime, been cataloged in various books. We can perform it by subjecting organisms to, the resistance of insects to insecticides, for example, is a good case of evolution happening before our eyes. So there's lots of cases. Even in humans, we can document changes, evolutionary changes in Americans in certain health parameters like blood pressure, cardiac disease over the last 50 or 60 years. So, evolution, it's not easy to see in real time because it's such a slow process, but we have sufficient examples to knock down the canard that you just raised.
We heard this one at the debate the other night. Dating methods just aren't reliable. Now, we had this and we sent it out to different labs and had it dated, and everybody had different results. It's all bogus and unreliable. You want to address that one?
Yeah, well, it's simply wrong. In order to explain why it is reliable, I have to go into a long disquisition. There are websites that will explain this to you, and at the end of the show, if you want resources, I can give you some of them. But scientists have realized that there are anomalies. So, for example, and this is one thing that creationists will say, that a living snail has been dated using carbon dating. It is 11,000 years old. So, evolutionists. What do you think about that? But then you look and you see that snail has been ingesting old carbon from limestone when it's built its shell. So it's actually, you get a sort of a fake date, but you know why. And carbon dating isn't, it actually is reliable. You can send it to different labs. There's an error range of a couple of %, but it's uniform. That's the way, by the way, archaeologists have dated a lot of things over historical times. But for really ancient stuff like dinosaurs or Precambrian things, you use other forms of dating like strontium, rubidium, uranium, lead dating, and those kinds of methods, which have their own ways of internally being checked. Sometimes you can have different minerals in the same rock, and you can use those to cross-calibrate each other. There's a very complicated but accurate way of doing that. And you find, as always, that things are nicely. So, these errors that are supposedly invalidate the whole methodology are things that we can explain based on anomalies in how rocks are formed or how animals eat ancient carbon, or slight variations in the amount of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere over time.
Talking here with Dr. Jerry Coyne, it seems that I read that carbon dating is accurate up to something like, like 60,000 years, something like that, yes?
I think the half-life is about 5,000 years. I wouldn't quote me on that, which means 60,000 seems a little bit long to me, because that would be, it would have gone down 1/2 to the power of 12, which is 1/32 times 1/32. So that'd be 1/900th of the original amount. It probably is, actually, because the methods of measuring this are pretty fine. But beyond some time like that, it becomes pretty worthless, and you need to use other methods of dating.
Well, the argument is that, hey, look, they carbon dated dinosaurs, and the results came back totally wrong.
Well, you don't carbon date dinosaurs because they lived, 100, 200 million years ago, and by that time, carbon-14 is useless. You use other methods. The way that's done is you don't date the fossils themselves, you date the igneous rocks in the layers that are around the fossils. Because fossils form in sedimentary rocks, dating is usually done in a different kind of rock, igneous rocks that are formed by heat. So you bracket the fossils on either side with dating and these igneous rock dating methods are actually quite reliable.
Yeah, it was a creationist website that was being commented on by an atheist YouTuber named Potholder54, and he was showing the carbon dating argument completely inappropriate when it comes to dinosaurs.
Yeah, well, that's just typical of creationists. It's like saying you're trying to monitor something that happens within a millisecond using a grandfather clock. You have to use the appropriate instruments to measure something of a particular age. But, none of this is real scientific objection. It's what they could cook up or what looks good to people who don't know any better. If you really wanted to learn about how dating methods are done, I took a course on this when I was an assistant professor. There are places you can go to find out, and places which answer these objections. If you want to educate yourself, the answers to these questions are all there. And it'll take you about 5 seconds on the internet to find the answers to these objections.
Next up on my list, there is no such thing as a beneficial mutation.
Yeah, that's common, and it's wrong. What's true is that most mutations are deleterious because they're sort of random accidental changes in an organism's genome. It's like you're taking something that's already well adapted to its environment and just nicking it somewhere in the DNA. The chances that that's going to cause an improvement in the organism's fitness, which what we mean by that is ability to leave offspring, is low. But there are lots of beneficial mutations. We see them all the time. Insecticide resistance is one of them. Anytime an organism responds to a human-imposed change in their environment, herbicides, insecticides, poisons dumped into the environment, the famous case of the peppered moth that used to be white and all of a sudden the environment became black because of industrial soot. We saw mutations arise that turned the moth black. They're actually there, but they were useful mutations. And you can also see them in the laboratory. There's a number of famous experiments where you subject things like bacteria to toxic conditions and mutations arise that are good for them. So, we have hundreds of cases of beneficial mutations, thousands probably. They're not as common as deleterious mutations. You have to admit that. That's just the way it works. But all you need is one. In the case of insecticide resistance, it's a single mutation basically makes a mosquito resistant to organophosphate insecticides. And what's interesting is it's exactly the same mutation in many different species of insects. It just happens to have arisen independently in different ones. So you get the same beneficial mutation over and over and over again in that case.
We heard this one again the other night, and I hear it all the time myself. The second law of thermodynamics, the entropy argument. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've heard it as well. Can you give us sort of a primer on the second law of thermodynamics and what the assertion is from the creationists?
Well, the second law basically, in a nutshell, is that entropy, which is a measure of order in the system, increases over time. Systems become more disordered over time. And you're talking about entire, what we call open systems. If you take an isolated part of the universe where nothing comes in or goes out, then the disorder will increase over time. Okay, now, superficially, it looks like evolution violates that because here on Earth, you start off with a bunch of disordered chemicals before life originated, and then life came about, and we had DNA, and we had the first replicators, and then we had bacteria, and then more complicated true cells we call eukaryotic organisms. And then things just ramified and became complex. So we start with a series of things that are very disordered, and it got more ordered. And creationists say, well, that's a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Can't happen. The problem is that they're looking at the Earth as if it were in a closed system in that case, that nothing is coming in or going out. The real fact is that none of that evolution would have happened unless there was an input of energy from outside the Earth, and that is the energy of the sun. So you need to consider when you're talking about evolution what actually fueled the whole process, and that is the burning off the nuclear fusion that's happening in the sun. And you can show that in the whole system of sun plus Earth, entropy is indeed increasing. So as the Earth becomes more ordered locally because of evolution, the combination of Earth plus sun, which is really the whole system, well, it's actually the universe is the whole system, is becoming more disordered. So nothing really is violating the second law there. That's just another canard that creationists make. I mean, if the second law of thermodynamics were true, if it prohibited evolution, it would also prohibit development. You would never be able to get a human being from a single fertilized egg because you're increasing order in that case. And the reason you can do that is because the mother is taking in energy, which ultimately comes from the sun, the plants, which feed the animals, which feed the mother. So for the same reason that evolution does not violate the second law, so development of a single organism doesn't violate the second law.
One thing I hear a lot from the Eric Hovens and the Kent Hovens and the Ray Comforts and the Ken Hams and their ilk is nobody's ever found a transitional fossil. They don't exist. It's a fantasy. You want to address that one?
Yeah, that's the easiest one to refute because we have an embarrassment of riches on that account. I'm actually surprised that Bill Nye didn't bring this up more. I think he mentioned Tiktaalik, which is a transitional fossil between fishes and amphibians. It's basically a fish with legs, more or less. It has many fish-like features like tail and fins, but it also has amphibian-like features. Sturdy fins. It has a neck, which enables it to stick its head up above the water. So it's exactly what you'd expect to find between if a fish were to evolve into an amphibian. But we don't. So that's, these things were actually predicted before they were found. That's another very powerful piece of evidence for evolution. Darwin predicted, for instance, that transitional fossils would be found in Africa between humans and apes if they existed. And sure enough, this was in 1871. We did not find those first transitional fossils until the early 1900s with Australopithecines discovered in Africa. But let me just give you the very brief list of the transitional fossils we have between major groups. So we have Tiktaalik, which is a transition between fish and amphibians. We have Ichthyostega, which is a transitional fossil, one of many, between amphibians and reptiles because it has features of both. We have mammal-like reptiles, which are things that are so intermediate, about 200 million years ago, between reptiles and mammals that you cannot classify them as either a reptile or a mammal just by looking at the bones. They're intermediate, absolutely. We have transitional fossils between reptiles and birds, which have just been discovered in my own scientific career, the feathered dinosaurs that they're starting to dig up in China. And of course, as I mentioned, we have the transitional fossils between our early sort of more chimpanzee-like ancestors. They weren't chimpanzees, but they were probably more like chimpanzees than we were. And we have the early human fossils that are basically have an ape-like skull sitting on top of a skeleton, which is basically modern human. I mean, what better combination of primitive and derived traits do you have? And so there's two pieces of evidence there that we have all these transitions between major groups. Oh, another one is the series of transitional fossils between whales and their terrestrial ancestors. Whales evolved from animals which are very much like small deer with hooves, artiodactyls, the sort of even-toed animals. And we see things that are transitional between land animals and whales. So early on, like about 40 million years ago, we see things that look a lot like whales, but they have legs on them, which are useless because they're only 18 inches long. And we can line these all up independently based on their dates, and we can see exactly what we would predict, given that whales evolved from land animals. So the evidence is twofold, that we, A, have these transitional fossils between many major groups, and B, they occur exactly at the time when they should have occurred. So we see these feathered dinosaurs after the non-feathered dinosaurs had already been in existence for some time, say 300 million years ago, and before we see modern birds, which are about 100 million years ago. These things show up at about between 200 and 100 million years ago. So it's not only that they look transitional, that they have a combination of ancestral and derived characteristics. They're basically dinosaurs with feathers and teeth, but they also occur in the fossil record independently and dated in times when they should have occurred if birds did indeed evolve from dinosaurs. And you can't get much better evidence for evolution than that.
You brought up the ape, the chimpanzee. My next question is, why are there still monkeys? If we evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? I'm phrasing it the way it is phrased to me by the defenders of Scripture. You want to address that one?
Yeah, well, there's the humorous response to the religious people from that, which is, if God made humans from dust, why is there still dust?
Yeah.
But, well, we didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We are apes. I mean, we're still apes. Humans are classified as primates. We're great apes, and we evolved from earlier apes. We did not evolve from chimpanzees that exist today. We shared a common ancestor, which was probably more like a chimpanzee than a human. We're the odd group out in the group of apes because we've undergone a lot more change since our divergence from the ancestor than a chimpanzee has. All the other apes are hairy. They knuckle walk. They're more arboreal than we are. We've evolved very quickly, probably for reasons we're not sure, but may have to do with being hunters on the open savanna. So their common ancestor is no longer there. It was a kind of ape that no longer exists. So that's the answer to that. I mean, we diverged from something that was very different from us and different from chimpanzees, and chimpanzees and humans evolved into different ecological niches, respectively. And we didn't evolve from chimps. We share a common ancestor. That common ancestor isn't there anymore.
With an observation of the human form, can we see right there evidence that we and chimpanzees have a common ancestor? I mean, is it the hair on the arms and legs? Are there other specific examples you'd like to bring out?
There's lots. I give them in my book in a chapter on, I think it's called Vestiges. I mean, well, not just chimpanzees. We're loaded with things that show our ancestry to things like reptiles, for example. We have genes in our human genome that used to make egg yolk, because we evolved from reptiles that laid eggs and they needed yolk to provision themselves. So the reptile genome contains DNA for making proteins to fill up their eggs to nourish the young. Well, humans have those genes too. It's just that they've been inactivated by mutations. If you sequence the human genome, you'll find 3 genes for making egg yolks, but they don't do anything. They've been knocked out by mutations. So how can any creationist possibly explain why God would provision us with useless genes? And, our whole genome is littered with remnants of our ancestry that are no longer useful. We have all these genes for smelling. They're called olfactory receptors, and they're dead. They've been inactivated by mutations. So, 97% of the human genome is just junk. A lot of that junk is composed of genes that used to have a function in our ancestors. For example, we descended from mammals that had a much better sense of smell than we did before we were primates. And we still have those genes in our DNA, but since we're a visual and an auditory organism, we don't need that sense of smell. Those genes have been inactivated by mutations and hasn't caused any problems. If you want to look at closer ancestry, every human at the age of 6 months develops a thick coat of hair called the lanugo. Preemies or premature infants are frequently born like this, and then it's shed before birth. Now, why would the good Lord give us a thick coat of hair at the age of 6 months and then have it disappear before we're born? It's of no use to us whatsoever because we're already well insulated in the womb. The fluid is nice and warm, and the fact is we're descended from animals that did develop a coat of hair and did not lose it, and those are the apes, the other apes to which we're related. So that itself is very strong evidence for common ancestry with things that were hairy. And,
I read an article a while back about the goosebumps, goosebumps on skin when you're cold or whenever you get the chills, and that may have an evolutionary explanation as well. Is that accurate?
Oh, yes. That's another example I give in the book. If you have a dog or a cat, particularly a cat, which I've had more cats and no dogs, or any animal like the squirrels outside my windowsill, when you see them exposed to the cold or in a threat display, their hair will erect. And that's caused by a tiny little muscle at the base of each hair called the erector pili. And it's useful in those animals because A, it fluffs their fur up and keeps them warm, and B, if you're a threat display, and everybody's seen a cat arching its back and fluffing its fur out, it makes you look bigger than you are. It helps scare off predators and competitors. Well, we have those same muscles, but they're useless. And when we get cold and when we are fearful, the same stimuli that actually erect those hairs in our relatives, the muscles contract and our hair stand up, but it doesn't do anything for us. We don't look bigger, and it doesn't provide any more insulation for us because we're basically naked apes to begin with. So goosebumps, they're a very good example of a vestigial trait in humans.
Talking here with Dr. Jerry Coyne. We will get to the phones in just a second, but I want to round out the rest of my list very quickly. The eye is too complex to have evolved. Does this play into the entropy thing, the complexity thing? It just becomes more chaotic. The complex eye would have never happened. Do you want to address that one?
Well, it's a little bit different argument. It's not based on the laws of physics. It's based on the idea that, and this is a false idea, that an eye would be useless unless all the parts were there to begin with. So, we have a retina, a cornea, ciliary muscles to control the cornea, the iris, the optic nerve. Unless those are all in place, you can't see. So how could that have possibly evolved in a step-by-step process? That's basically an argument which tries to turn Darwinism on its head, because Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection says that to get a complex adaptation, it has to form not only step-by-step, but each step of that process has to confer a slight incremental reproductive advantage to its possessor. And if you think that an eye can only be useful in its final form, then how could that evolve in an advantageous step-by-step process? Well, Darwin answered that in The Origin in 1859. It's surprising it still comes up, which is we can see all the rudimentary stages by which a complex eye like ours could have formed present in other animals. If you look at the planaria worm, it has this light-sensitive eye spot. If you look at mollusks, they have the same eye spot, but it's in a little cup, which helps focus the light on that eye spot. And then there's some more advanced invertebrates where there's a lens over that helps focus the light even better. And so we can see sort of all the stages that could have happened in the evolution of a complex camera eye like humans or octopi have if we look across the animal kingdom. It's a very clever way of actually showing that this could have happened adaptively. We can see the steps, although they're not sequential in time as it happened in the evolution of our eyes. We can see them looking across animals, and you can envision them being put together in time. And each of those animals, of course, has a rudimentary eye, but it's a functional eye. It conveys some advantage to the organism. So you can envision an adaptive step-by-step process whereby you go from a simple pigmented eye spot to a complex eye with lens, cornea, optic nerve, etc., and each step in that process would be adaptive. Once you can show that, then the argument against that complexity evolving by evolution disappears. You can also do it by computers, by the way. There was a paper about 20 years ago where they just started with an eye spot and made random computer glitches that would change it one way or the other, and lo and behold, in 86,000 generations of random mutations and then selection, you get a complex camera eye. So that argument, along with all the other arguments for so-called unevolvable complex traits, are basically specious. We always, when we look hard enough, are able to find a way that it could have evolved in a sequential process whereby each step confers an advantage over the previous step.
Dr. Coyne, in your book or in other writings, do you address abiogenesis? How does something living come from non-living matter? Where does the first cell come from? That argument?
I don't address it because, I say that we don't understand it, which is the truth. I mean, look, as scientists, when we come up against a problem whose answer we don't know, we have to admit it. Unlike the religious people that when they come up with the same problem, I mean, they use that as evidence that God did it. But scientists are starting to make inroads on this now. We know, for example, that the first replicator was probably not DNA, but RNA. And there's a number of theories about how it could have happened. I predicted that within 50 years we'll be able to create life in the lab, not deliberately, but by taking chemicals and subjecting them to the conditions of the early Earth. So we'll probably never know how life evolved because it evolved in a way that we weren't there to see, and the fossils of it are no longer there until you get to bacteria, which are already pretty highly evolved. But we don't need to do that to show that life could evolve by materialistic processes. All we have to do is show that in the laboratory under primitive Earth-like conditions, we can get the formation of life-like substances. And I think that will probably happen within our lifetime. We'll never know the answer to that question, but we'll at least know that it is conceivable to get life from non-life.
How do you approach the morality question in relation to evolution? Evolution doesn't account for moral or ethical behavior. It's not explainable. It's not observable in the evolutionary model. Do you speak to that at all?
Well, it is. I mean, that's another creationist argument, one that's used by Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, saying that altruism and what he calls our moral instinct or the moral law can't have evolved by natural selection, so it must have been given us by God. When you start looking closer, you see that a lot of our relatives show the rudimentary kinds of morality that you would expect if it had some evolutionary basis. Capuchin monkeys, for example, show senses of fairness. Some of the experiments that show this are quite striking. You can find them on YouTube. If you give a monkey a grape and you give a monkey in the next cage a cucumber, grapes are much tastier than cucumber. The monkeys in the next cage goes nuts and hurls the cucumber out of the cage and has a fit, even though if you gave the other monkey a cucumber, he wouldn't do that. So you can see there's an elementary sense of fairness at play there. There's empathy in animals and chimpanzees. Franz de Waal, the primatologist, has made his career out of showing forms of morality existing in our relatives. You would expect this to evolve in small groups of social animals because they need to take care of each other. There's forms of sort of altruism, what we call reciprocal altruism, that evolved not only in primates but in lions, where they cooperate with each other because a pack can get more meat than a single animal can, even for a single animal. And the closer we look at animal behavior and the more ethology, which is the study of behavior, becomes predominant in biology, the more evidence we find that we see the rudiments of morality in our relatives. Darwin, of course, was the first person to postulate this in 1871. Now, on top of this, we have a cultural overlay, which enables us to do things that could not have evolved, like pure altruism. Somebody that throws themselves on a hand grenade to kill himself to save his fellow soldiers. That's the kind of behavior that could not have evolved because you're giving up your genetic endowment to save people to whom you're not related at all. But there's no real problem in explaining that either because there's learning. If you look at young children, they're not altruistic. We're born with empathy, but empathy only to those people who we're related to, our parents and the people that we're familiar with. That's exactly what you'd expect if those feelings evolved in a social primate. We're not born with a desire to help people that we're not familiar with. That is instilled in humans by learning and culture. And that's why babies are not altruistic and adults are. Paul Bloom has just published a new book on this. I can't remember the title of it, but he explains the evolution of morality from his observations of young children.
One more, and I will get to the switchboard. So you're saying everything just happened by chance?
Well, no, I'm not saying that. I mean, you're probably trying to bait me.
I'm playing apologist here. I'm playing young Earth creationist. Come on, everything just happened? You think we all just got here by chance? That's ridiculous. How would you address?
That's probably the second most common misconception about evolution after the one you raised earlier, that it's just a theory. But that's, again, based on a misconception. The first one was a misconception on what scientists mean by theory. This one is evolution is not a chance process, at least most evolution by natural selection. It's a combination of a chance process, which is random mutations arising, mutations that happen whether or not they're good for the reproduction of their carriers. But then that variation is filtered out by a purely deterministic process of natural selection, which takes those mutations, which are good. It doesn't really take them. This is just what happens. It's processed. And they increase in frequency in the population because they outcompete the bad mutations. So when you say it doesn't happen by chance, that's either a willful or an ignorant characterization of what evolution is. It's a combination. It's a unique combination of a chance process combined with a deterministic process. If you just had the pure chance in there, the mutational part of that process, you wouldn't get evolution. You just have everything degenerating by mutation. It's the deterministic, non-chance process of natural selection that really accounts for the design features of organisms that impress us most and were used to be attributed to God.
Let's go to the switchboard and talk to area code 405. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast with Dr. Jerry Coyne. Who's this?
Hi, Seth. This is Emily.
Emily, hello. Thanks so much for calling. What do you have for us tonight?
Well, I wanted to share a bit about me growing up when I was a Christian and how I wanted to learn about evolution. When I was a kid, I remember reading ahead in my science books, and I would see, the chapters on evolution and explaining through it. And always when it seemed like my teachers were getting close to it, they'd just skip over it. And I'd always want to raise my hand and be like, hey, why aren't we learning this stuff?
Was it the kind of culture where if it was insinuated that you were an animal, they thought it was an insult, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that happened to me, in fact. It's done deliberately because evolution is such a sensitive subject. Teachers usually leave it to the end, hoping that they won't get to it. Because if their kids go home and say, we learned about evolution, then the teacher's going to get in trouble. So it's very common. It's unfortunate because evolution should really be taught at the beginning of any biology course. It is the unifying theory of biology. It explains why everything is what it is. Unfortunately, because of this sort of religious opposition to that theory, it is the only theory of biology that actually offends religious people. They just leave it to the end, and kids don't get taught it, and they miss out on this great source of wonder and explanatory value that they could have had otherwise.
Yeah, I'd always try to ask my family about it, but I'd always get that's not how it was. And one time when I was trying to ask my dad about it, he kind of stopped me and he was like, Emily, what sounds more ridiculous, that we came from soup or that we came from mud? And I was just stunned by it. I was like, they both sound kind of stupid.
Yeah, well, I mean, but there's theories that include both of those, that life evolved on clay substrate and life evolved in some kind of primordial soup. I mean, it doesn't sound stupid if you know anything about science. It just, it's a way of characterizing things to make fun of science. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
So I hope you've made up for this deficit.
I have. Okay. I've been reading up on it a lot.
That's good.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily, so much for listening, and thanks for calling.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
All right, take care. Do you find that's often the case? People don't feel special if they're not the center of the universe, that they're not the child of a divine king. Hey, you're just an animal part of a universe that doesn't care if you exist. That's threatening to a lot of people, yes?
Yeah, I mean, evolution threatens our specialness in many ways, and of course our specialness is tied in with religious considerations because the Bible says we're special, as do many other books. Yeah, we've evolved like any other animal, so we're just beasts. Second of all, if we're going to beasts, well, why not behave like beasts? So where does morality come from? The idea that evolution is a mindless, uncontrolled, unguided process that's materialistic is threatening to people. There's nobody behind it driving it towards human beings. That's threatening as well. There's many, many aspects of the process that people could consider threatening to them, especially if you're brought up to see humans as the unique animal, the one that's not only different from others, but the special object of God's attention. And of course, that's the reason why evolution is so widely rejected by Americans.
Area code 909. Thanks for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast with Dr. Jerry Coyne. Who's this?
This is Tony in California. I just want to shout out a quick thank you to both of you because I am a happy and proud atheist. And you guys both played a huge part in giving me the ammunition to defend myself in a place where a lot of people don't understand me and whatnot. And then I wanted to throw out a couple quick points, and if I could posit a question, would that be cool?
Sure, quickly. What do you have?
I've read both of your guys' books, or well, at least Why Evolution is True and Deconverted, and I think they're both awesome. They're both great. Well, I love them both, and I think, Seth, you have a way of words that kind of delivers to people that don't have those strong attention span, so to speak. And then Jerry,
and there's pop-ups and coloring segments. No, dude, that's exactly the best compliment you could give me. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and then Jerry, you kind of do that on the academic front with the really strong facts. When you present them, you have a hard time really kind of rationalizing it any other way. It's just such strong fact that you're like, yeah, that's so believable. But in combination of both of those ideas, I think a lot of people address when you're kind of like talking to creationists or fundamentalists or whoever you're trying to debate your point to. For example, I was having a conversation with my sister after I read Why Evolution is True, and I was kind of explaining how there's not just a half an eye, and she kind of came back at me with, oh, you're using such lofty vocabulary, you're just kind of throwing words out there to confuse me. And I think that that's like a big problem with a lot of people, at least the majority of people. Like there's this attention span issue I was kind of mentioning, like people are willing to receive information and then sometimes they just shut their gate. It's like words are being spat at them and then either they don't understand them or they're being willfully ignorant of them. I just kind of want to ask both of you, what's the best way to circumnavigate that, to get the really solid, really strong scientific points across in a way that people who normally wouldn't understand them could?
Well, it's curious that you say that about evolution, that it's a problem of big words and short attention spans, because those same people that say, I can't be bothered, it's all a bunch of hokum, they'll accept medical research, chemistry, if we tell them that benzene has 6 carbons, the DNA is a double-stranded molecule. They have no problem with that. Their attention span is limited only when it comes to evolution. And I think it's because evolution is, they don't want to hear it, not because it's hard, because it's one of the easiest things to explain that there is. It's a lot easier to explain that than it is to explain how metabolism works. It's that what Seth said, it's threatening to their worldview, their view of themselves as special. So my view is, and that's exactly how I wrote the book, you treat the person as somebody who's intelligent and curious. They don't have to be geniuses, and just teach them. And if they're resistant to being taught the simple facts, you can point out to anybody that this looks like a dinosaur, but it has feathers. You don't have to have a long attention span to grasp that. If they reject that, then it's hopeless. They have to be open to being convinced. And if given that, then it's just the techniques of good pedagogy. I don't think it really is a problem of attention span. By the way, all the evidence for evolution is on the internet, so if you really have that short an attention span, you can just click on it, and there's websites to go to learn it.
Yeah, don't go to answersingenesis.com to learn it, but yeah, the internet's a great resource for sure. Hey, thanks for the kind words and thanks for the call, my friend. It means a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just to let you know, I had a conversation with my heroes today and it put a smile on my face. So you guys both do great work, and much thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
This does bring up the point of how the internet has really made the entire world the classroom. No longer is this information locked up in university halls or, these tiny sort of cubicles. Anyone, anywhere who has the inclination and desire and passion to learn can. We have no excuses left. There's so much amazing stuff out there. Just a cursory search of almost any topic, including evolution, will open our world right up.
Absolutely. And there's really good websites. The University of California, Berkeley has one. There's one called 101 Evidences for Macroevolution, which is a bit mistitled because it's a very good general website on the evidence for evolution. But again, you have to have the curiosity. You have to have the open mind. Given that, then you can inform yourself very quickly. For example, if you hear the view that everything happened by chance, you can just Google that. Make sure you stay away from the creationist websites because they like to give themselves titles that make people think that they're really scientific. But if you really want to learn how to dispel these notions, you can do it within seconds on the internet, and that's been a really good tool.
It gets a little tricky, though, whenever some of these organizations will parade out a Ph.D., right? We saw it the other night on television. It's one Ph.D. after the other. Look who we have, a vetted, pedigreed scientist, and he believes in a 6,000-year-old Earth and Adam and Eve and the snake. Very challenging for those who don't have their eyes and ears open at all times, yes?
That's what Ken Ham did, actually, in the Ham-Nye debate. And the proper response to that is, well, yeah, every scientist that you've given us, none of them have been biologists, which is true in his case. There's a guy that invented, I can't remember when he invented some piece of technology, medical doctors, engineers, that's who they get. You have a hard time finding a working biologist that is opposed to evolution.
But they do exist, and how does that happen? How do we find people who are otherwise extremely reasonable, who are trained scientists who in one area of their lives, you mentioned Francis Collins, one area of their lives believe in the irrational? How does this happen?
Well, Seth, you'd probably be able to answer that more than I do. I think Michael Shermer's been working on this. He has a book, I think, called Why People Believe Ridiculous Things. It's that residuum of faith that you need to hold on to. It could be indoctrination. When you're a child, there's some need to still retain these beliefs, but compartmentalize them from the other beliefs, which would debunk them. It would cause cognitive dissonance otherwise. So it's the same answer why people are religious in a world where there's no evidence for God whatsoever. You have reasons that you need to believe. And, of course, the smarter you are, the better you are at rationalizing your beliefs. So some of the best advocates for creationism are people that are really smart, that have PhDs, because they can walk the walk and talk the talk, and they sound like academics, and they use big words. But they still have that latent cognitive dissonance in there. I don't really understand it myself because I'm not a victim of it.
Well, so if Ken Ham had issued the invitation to you to debate him at the Creation Museum, would you have accepted?
No, I don't. I've published this on my website. I don't debate creationists. I think it's a rhetorical exercise rather than an exercise in pedagogy. It's whoever can talk the best wins. And you cannot adjudicate a very difficult issue like evolution, which involves things like the fossil record, geology, morphology, vestigial organs, geography of life, biochemistry. All those things are evidence. You can't debate those all in a 1-hour debate. That's why, my preferred venue for arguing for evolution is to write articles and release them into the ether, like my book or some magazine articles I've written, and let people read them and think for themselves. And then they can go over and read the creationist articles and judge for themselves. So that's the way to do it. You don't have this sort of contest on who's the glibest and who talks the best, because that's no way to settle a scientific question. Besides, there's no need to debate creationists. The issue is already settled in the scientific community. And that's the second reason. Third reason is you don't want to give credibility to them as scientists. I think it was Richard Dawkins that invited you to debate creation and said, well, it's going to look good on your curriculum, invitee, but not on mine. And finally, Ken Ham had this debate at the Creation Museum. The people that paid, the money went to Ham. It's at the Creation Museum. It gives them credibility. They're selling DVDs of the debate, and the profits are going to support the Creation Museum. The Creation Museum is dedicated to telling lies to children about biology, which is exactly the opposite of what people like me and Bill Nye want to do. So, although it's tempting to want to fight for your field on a platform like that, I think the downside is much worse than the upside.
Area code 423. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
This is Mike from Tennessee.
Mike, thanks so much for waiting. Thanks for calling. You're on the air with Dr. Jerry Coyne. What do you have for us?
My situation is I'm an engineer living in Knoxville, Tennessee, and my parents live in a town close by. My dad's a doctor, and my sister is also a doctor, and they're both ridiculously religious. My sister accepts evolution. She accepts the Big Bang, but she cannot take it a step further because, you ask her about the Big Bang. I've had a couple of conversations with her, and she'll say that it doesn't contradict the Bible because who's to say that when God said, let there be light, who's to say that that was not the Big Bang? Her take on evolution was that humans were created last. So her interpretation of what the Bible says is it wasn't 7 literal days, that it took millions or maybe even billions of years. And the story of the Bible basically chronicles what happened throughout different stages of that process. So she basically says that God orchestrated evolution. It's funny because she's such a smart person. She's a medical doctor, right? But she's been able to rationalize and come up with this idea that God orchestrated evolution, and the final step in evolution was man. I try to. Well,
the final step in evolution, and according to that, would be the human louse, because that evolved after humans did. So all the human-specific parasites are more advanced or later than we are, which of course isn't in the Bible. So, there's 2 ways you can interpret what you say, and I'm not clear which one it is. If you just say that the Genesis account is how evolution happened, well, that can't be true, because even if things were created over billions of years, they're still created, and the order in which they're created in Genesis is not the same as the order in which they're evolved. And as you probably know, the order of things appearing in the first and second chapter of Genesis is different. But there's another way of looking at it, which is that the real evolution happened, but it was guided by God, which we call theistic evolution. And that's indistinguishable in principle, looking at it from normal evolution. It's just that you think God did it. And that's, we don't accept that in science because there's no evidence for it. But if she accepts that kind of theistic evolution, she's basically down with evolution. So it sounds like what you really want to do is not make her accept evolution, but dispel her religious ideas. That's what you're going to have to do if she holds to a Genesis account of life.
That's an awesome point, and I'll keep looking. What did it for me was I thought initially that atheism was sort of like a conspiracy theory. And I don't know if you looked into some conspiracy theories today. Usually you can look online and find an awesome person that debunks it. And I was never able to find the person that debunked religion. So maybe, I'll keep looking and see if I can.
There's plenty of people that debunked religion, including the host of this show, plus Harris, Hitchens, Dennett, Dawkins.
I wasn't. So when I saw, when I started seeing debates between atheism and religion, I wasn't able to find anybody that debunked the position that the atheist arguing against a religious person. I wasn't able to find that. So I feel like if I could keep looking and maybe find an argument that's irrefutable, but then again,
sorry, what kind of argument are you looking for?
We need to make a distinction too, I think. Atheism doesn't necessarily inform anything else. A non-belief in God isn't necessarily an acceptance of evolution or anything else. Now, you'll find that there are many, many atheists who do accept the theory of evolution, but being a non-theist, being an atheist, doesn't necessarily inform anything else. And so don't confuse the two, because one doesn't necessarily guarantee the other, okay?
That's a great point, and maybe I need to think about that some more. It's frustrating because she's so close, and trying to figure out a way to. And you know what? Maybe I just need to take a step back and let her put all the pieces together. So something to think about.
I appreciate your call very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, take it easy. There is, of course, a common teaching in the church that science is one big conspiracy, right? All the scientists got together at a big kegger somewhere, And they said, wouldn't it be awesome if we just killed God? Why don't we all come up with this amazing theory of evolution? And we'll all agree on it, and then we'll all publish papers on it, and then this will be our attack. We'll be minions of Satan. I mean, the idea that scientists get together and high five and agree on everything they do is laugh out loud ridiculous.
Absolutely, for two reasons. First of all, most scientists are still religious, as particularly the less accomplished ones. The better and better you get as a scientist, the less and less religious you get. But the fact is that American scientists as a whole, about 30 to 40% of them believe in God. And yet those people are largely adherents to evolution. So if it was a conspiracy to kill God, there's a lot of people in on those conspiracies that don't want to kill God. And the second thing is that if it was a conspiracy and there was no evidence for evolution, the one apostate, the one person who wanted to dissent from that and say, look, the emperor has no clothes, all the evidence is fudged, that person will become famous as a scientist. The way you get famous as a scientist is by overturning established paradigms. So if evolution was just all cooked up and the data were all made up or distorted by scientists, eventually somebody's going to see that they're going to make a name for themselves if they actually show that the evidence is cooked. And that's the way science works, but that hasn't happened, of course, because the evidence isn't cooked. I mean, I never understand this conspiracy theory stuff. If you live any of your life among scientists or see how the process works, you would see how laughable that accusation really is.
Let's do one final call before we zip it up tonight. Area code 412. Thank you for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist Radio podcast with Dr. Jerry Coyne. Who's this?
This is Dave. How are you?
Dave, thanks for calling. Thanks for being a part of the show. You have a question or comment tonight?
Yeah, I sure do. Jerry, religious education starts at baptism and goes to confirmation if you're a Catholic in 6th and 7th grade. My 13-year-old hasn't even been exposed to evolution in school yet. How do you think that education can catch up with?
Well, there's two ways to do that. Yeah, I mean, the problem is that people get immunized against evolution before they ever get exposed to it through religion. Now, Catholicism is one of the religions that's generally okay with evolution, but even so, 27% of Catholics in America are young Earth creationists. So there's two solutions to your problem. The first one is start teaching kids evolution when they get baptized and let them fight it out in their own brains. But of course, that's impractical because they can't learn. My solution would be to not impose your religion on your children until they're old enough to make a decision. Of course, that's completely anathema. You know, every parent thinks they have the right to indoctrinate their children with their religious beliefs. But by so doing, they're not only prohibiting their children from choosing what they want to believe, but they're, in many ways, they're making them resistant to science, like evolution, global warming, things like Christian Science. You become resistant to medicine. So, I mean, I really, if I could wave my wand and change the world, it would be that no parent could indoctrinate their children with any kind of religious belief until they were like 15 years old or 16 years old. I mean, that would be the solution. Otherwise, you just start teaching evolution in elementary school, which you can do. There are books for children that are 6 years old on evolution.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not actually a theist. I was using Catholicism as a comparison to other religions, but by the time they're 13, they already have a well-formed relationship with a God. So it's really hard to understand how kids come into junior high and high school with a poor education at best when it comes to evolution, and it is such a fundamental building block in our...
not just a poor education with respect to evolution, they're actively resistant to it because their religion has taught them that it didn't happen. And, 46% of Americans are young Earth creationists, so this is not an uncommon thing. And all of those people are... Virtually all of them. I've only met one non-religious creationist in my life. It all comes from religion. So the way to get kids to learn about evolution, the first thing you have to do is make them open to it. And in order to do that, you cannot propagandize them with the kind of religion that makes them resistant to evolution. And that's on most kinds of religion. So the problem ultimately devolves, and this is why, I guess this rounds out the show, this is why I'm much more of an activist atheist these days. Creationism is ultimately a result of religion. It's so plain on the face of it. And in order to get Americans to embrace evolution, if that's your goal, you have to get them to give up their religion, or at least the kind of religion that makes them resistant to evolution, which is most kinds of theistic religion.
Do you think indoctrination will ever get the frown? You waved your wand. I'd love to see that happen, but indoctrination seems to be part of the problem as well.
Well, except that I don't think it's inevitable. If you look at the case of Europe, for example, most parts of Northern Europe are largely atheistic. Kids do not get religious education. They're not taught to believe in anything because their parents don't believe in anything. And of course, if you look at those countries, the acceptance of evolution is high. It's up in the 80s to 90%, whereas in the United States, it's 30%, 40%, something like that. So there's a definite correlation between the religiosity of a country and its resistance to evolution across the world.
Well, don't give up hope, too, because non-belief is the fastest growing demo, and you're talking to a guy who was once heavily indoctrinated. I mean, don't think it's hopeless, man. Just keep planting the seeds.
Myself, I was indoctrinated Catholic and raised two of my children through Catholic education and, refused to raise my third.
Dude, I think we just keep pitching rationality. It was Dr. Peter Boghossian was talking about what he called micro-inoculations against the religious nonsense out there. Just keep bringing the facts and the evidence to light. Also, when it comes to raising children, we did a great show last year with Dale McGowan called Secular Parenting, which is a great way not to teach your children what to think, but to raise them in an environment where they have the tools to know how to think, and then they can properly process the world around them. And I'll link to that show in the description box of this video for anybody who's interested. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate you. Thanks for being a part of the show tonight.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Coyne, if there was a believer, a creationist, a person who rejected evolution within the sound of your voice tonight, as an educator and a rationalist, what would you say to him? I mean, you guys are talking over a beer. What would you say?
I'd say, here's my book, read. Because it's a lot faster than having to sit down and give them all the evidence. It really is. And if they're unwilling to read it, that means they're not curious about what the truth is, and it's hopeless. And then talking to them for hours over a beer would have been hopeless too. So,
is Why Evolution is True the book, that the first book you'd give them?
Yeah, or, there's other good books. Richard Dawkins has one called The Greatest Show on Earth, which is another presentation of the evidence for evolution. That's pretty much the competitors. There's not many books. That's why I wrote my book, because there was an open field for this kind of thing. But now lots of biology textbooks in general will start off talking about the evidence for evolution. But if you just want to, learn about what it is and see how strong it is and how pervasive it is, I would just say, read a book. There's two of them. I mean, unfortunately, one of them is mine. I'm not trying to make money here, but
no, please do. Trust me. Look, I told you this off the air, that when I was sort of freshly extricated from my faith, I discovered your book, Why Evolution is True. And you didn't just have the knowledge, but you were a good teacher. And I benefited so greatly from the book that I'm glad to help pitch it on the radio. In fact, I'm going to actually include the link to purchase the book in the description box of this show. And I would encourage listeners to support this man and his work. So don't apologize. It's awesome. Okay.
Well, I don't like to be self-aggrandizing. I wrote the book because there wasn't anything like it, and the general public needed to know what the evidence for evolution was. Evidence is available mostly to scientists, and Richard decided to write his about the same time. So we have two books on the market, and they're both complementary. They're not identical. So if you really want to know the evidence, I would urge people to read both of them.
Dr. Jerry Coyne, it's been a real pleasure. You're a fantastic guest. I may have to have you back tomorrow.
Well, the pleasure was mine, I assure you.
Awesome. Dr. Jerry Coyne. Tonight's show brought to you by Audible.com. If you want to listen to it, Audible has it over 150,000 titles in virtually every genre. Find what you're looking for. A free audiobook and a free 30-day trial right now. Go to audibletrial.com/thethinkingatheist. I will see you next week on the Thinking Atheist Radio Podcast. Take it easy.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.